Welcome back to A View from Mulberry Street with Matthew J. Mary, attorney at law. I've been an attorney for 45 years practicing criminal defense law. And I guess most of my famous cases had to do with organized crime. But this show really isn't about me being a lawyer or me being a great lawyer or me being something special at the courthouse, although I think I'm different than most of the guys who've walked in any courthouse in New York City. I have traveled all around the country to various federal courts. Maybe I've been in about 15 different states. It's also about who I am, where I started out. And as I said in my first episode, my first residence was on Mulberry Street, 146 Mulberry Street. That's on top of Angelo's Restaurant, what used to be Angelo's Restaurant, next to the Cannone King, Cafe Palermo. That wasn't there in 1950, but it sure is there now. Great cannolis, by the way. And so that's what we named the show. A View from Mulberry Street. That's where I started. I grew up in Knickerbocker Village, the Lower East Side, what we proudly call the Fourth Ward. And throughout all these episodes of this podcast, I'm going to be talking about special cases. Today, we hope to talk a lot about the commission case, but I'm not going to make this like a neat scholarly package of the commission case, tell you everything about the commission case, wrap it up and put a bow on top and say, well, there's my version of the commission case. I mean, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the characters involved in the commission case, and we're probably going to accidentally veer off into other subjects. And I think what we're mostly going to explore on this show is not just famous legal cases like the commission case, like the Tommy Karate case, but we're going to talk about people, places, and things. And we're going to talk about another viewpoint than what you've ever seen. Getting to the commission case, one night in the middle of the night, I woke up and I couldn't sleep, and I put on the TV, and there was Rudi Giuliani, and he was boasting on a video program called Mobsters. There are probably 1,000 episodes of that can be viewed on late night internet TV. And anyhow, Rudi Giuliani was boasting about the commission case, how this was the greatest case in the history of criminal justice, in the annals of organized crime prosecutions. Rudi, single-handedly, according to him, took down the entire mafia, And if you didn't know anything and you just watched Rudi for 1 hour, you would say, oh my God, Rudi is right. Wow. And indeed, there were a lot of wiretaps in the commission case. And the wiretaps captured a lot of stuff on them that was truly incriminating. But on the other hand, most people watching that TV program would never know that all of those wiretaps were obtained by the government illegally. And, once upon a time, President Johnson created a commission on organized crime, the National Commission on Organized Crime, way back, I think, in 1966. And what stunned me was one phrase from that report, which was quite lengthy. And it stunned me back then when I read it. I was about 16 years old, and it stuns me right now that I'm an old man. And that is that the commission, the Presidential Commission on Organized Crime, concluded that organized crime must be obliterated from the face of the earth at all cost. At all cost. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean at all costs? Well, let me tell you what it means. It means that in order for the government to accomplish their stated goal of obliterating organized crime from the face of the earth, what they had to do was to prostitute the entire criminal justice system. They had to prosecute people by prostituting their own integrity over and over and over for decades. And in my mind, the commission case, according to Rudi Giuliani, was their golden, the golden cow, right? The golden calf. But to me, it is a perfect example of how the government does everything wrong in order to achieve its goals. So we're going to get into that a little bit. How I got into the commission case was that I represented a fellow by the name of Stefano Cannone, Cannone. He's long dead. His nickname was Stevie Beef, and I happen to know Steve from the neighborhood before I was a lawyer as a little kid, and he hired me to represent him in the commission case. And it was probably, up to that point, it had been the biggest case that I had ever been in, maybe still is. And I represented Steve, and Steve was deadly sick. He had a serious heart condition. Even the FBI was afraid to move him. They wouldn't move him. And the judge didn't believe it, and I told Judge Owen, Judge, even FBI agent Marshall, who was the head agent on the case, Pat Marshall, I said, Pat Marshall will not move Mr. Cannone. And so they had to give him house arrest when everyone else got locked up for the duration of the case. And that's how I came into the commission case. At the beginning of the commission case, they piled up so many tape recordings that it filled up 2 huge tables in the courtroom and high up. And they gave us 1 year. People often ask, how long do you get as a lawyer to go through discovery? Well, there was so much discovery in that case that they gave us 1 year just to go through the tape recordings and then report back to the judge and define whatever the legal issues were to be. One of the big issues in the commission case was the issue of whether or not Joseph Bonanno, who they claimed was so-called boss of the Bonanno family, whether or not Joseph Bonanno would be able to testify in the case under a forced subpoena. And Joseph Bonanno took the position from his home in Tucson, Arizona, that he was too medically ill to even answer the subpoena, and he refused to come to New York for the subpoena. So what did the government do? The Southern District of New York, which is located at Foley Square in Manhattan, the Southern District of New York was relocated to Tucson, Arizona, to the federal courthouse. And they moved all the lawyers, the prosecutors, the entire court staff of the Southern District in New York into a courthouse in Tucson, Arizona. And we had a hearing there to determine whether or not Joseph Bonanno was medically able to answer a subpoena. And that was a hearing that was conducted by Rudi Giuliani. And for Mr. Bonanno, my inspiration to be a lawyer, a fellow named Albert Krieger. And any of you out there who are lawyers certainly know who Albert Krieger was, one of the greatest criminal defense lawyers in the history of this country. And Al Krieger was representing Mr. Bonanno, and the rest of us had to be there in the courtroom. We didn't participate in that particular proceeding, but it was quite an exciting time for me. I was 35 years old, and we had to fly out to Arizona, all the lawyers, big shot lawyers, Jimmy LaRosa leading the pack. And we were in the courtroom, and there came a point in time when there was a break in the proceeding. And Mr. Bonanno asked Al Krieger to come over to me and to ask me if I would talk to him. And, I was quite, actually, I have to confess, I was quite excited. about talking to Joe Bonanno. And I had met him years before when I was 14 years old. And now I was 35 years old and I was a lawyer. And when I walked over to talk to him, he basically started off by saying, "What do you think is going to happen to me?" And I told him, if you continue to refuse to answer the questions, they're going to lock you up today and put you in jail until the commission case is over. And that's exactly what they did to him. And they actually locked him up at the end of the day. But after I spoke to him, he called his granddaughter over, and he took off his watch and his ring and took his money out of his pocket and gave it to her and said, "I won't be coming home tonight." And he had a very thick Italian accent. And he said to me, he said, "Matt," he said, "I want you, when you go back to New York, I want you to tell the boys in New York," meaning the defendants in the commission case, "that Mr. Joe is no rat." And he explained to me that this book that he had written, which was the basis for the commission case, at least Rudi Giuliani said that it was, he explained to me that he had never even written the book, but in the book there was no accusations against anyone of criminal activity. He said it's all about dead people, and it's not about actual crimes that anyone could be prosecuted for. But he realized that it was a mistake for that book to go out under his name, and it caused a lot of havoc for a lot of people. But I appreciated his sincerity when he looked me in the eye and said, "Mr. Joe is no rat." And that was quite a meeting. It had a lot of emotional impact for me for many, many reasons, which maybe I'll get into in a future broadcast. But so meeting Joe Bonanno again under those circumstances was a thrill for me, I have to say. It really was. And also another individual who became a lifelong friend of mine through the commission case mostly, Carmine Persico. And I had met Carmine Persico when I was 18 years old, and he was 34 years old. And on that same day, I met his son, Alphonse Persico, who is 14 years old. Alphonse Persico is still my friend today. I email him not every day, but often. He's one of the finest people that I've ever met in my life, talking about the father and the son. And anyhow, I had known Carmine Persco from the time I was 18. And then when I became a lawyer in the commission case, he was representing himself, and I was representing Cannone, Stevie Beef. And of course, we would have meetings over at the Metropolitan Correctional Center, the MCC, which was closed recently because it's such a hellhole. But back then, it was spanking brand new, and no problems existed back then in terms of the physical plant. And the lawyers in the commission case would be up in the visiting room almost every day, it seemed, and we'd be discussing that case. And so I developed a relationship with Carmine Persco at that time. That's back now we're in 1985, and I'm about 35 years old then. Well, anyhow, fast forwarding to more recent years, about 2014, maybe earlier than that, I started communicating with Carmine Persco again. Carmine had been accumulating a lot of legal facts and documents, and I started to go through those documents for him. He in prison, me in my office and at home, and I spent a couple of years, sorting things out, sorting out the new documentation that was appearing here, there, and everywhere. And in fact, a lot of hidden material that the government did not release for 30 years that should have been given to Carmine Persco and other defendants in the commission case. It was hidden for decades by accident this stuff starts to be uncovered by other defendants in other cases, in other matters. And lo and behold, it seemed that it was very clear that in the commission case, the entire case against Carmine Persco was based upon not only evidence that was achieved against the other defendants through illegal wiretaps, but there were documents that the FBI had in their possession which could have been used by Carmine Persico to try to prove he was not guilty. Namely, the reason that the government was able to bring Carmine Persco, Junior Persco, into the commission case was because of what I call vicarious liability. Now, what do I mean by that? Carmine Persco, during the time that the so-called crimes in the commission case were occurring, was incarcerated. He was in prison for almost the entire period of time in question. So how in the world can they possibly indict him as a defendant in this landmark case? And here's how they did it. They accused Carmine Persco of being the boss of what they call Colombo family. And their theory was that anything that was done by his so-called underlings was done in his name, and therefore he is guilty. So, to kind of make a long story short, what the government was saying is that whatever the guys in the street were doing, that Carmine was responsible, even though he was in prison, even though he didn't know anything, even though no one asked his permission to do X, Y, or Z, he was still guilty. And why was he guilty? Because they accused him of being, quote, the boss. Well, lo and behold, what kind of documents do you think that the government hid for 30 years? For 30 years, they had documents where the government's chief cooperator, a guy named Greg Scarpa, which we're going to talk a lot about Greg Scarpa in future broadcasts. We might even talk a little bit about him today. But Greg Scarpa was the quintessential cooperator. He was cooperating long before Joe Valachi was. And he was giving information to the government from 1956. Anyhow, in the secret government documents, which we stumbled upon, that were hidden during the commission trial in the 1980s, there were documents indicating that not only Greg Scarpa, but FBI agents had submitted official reports, what we call 302s, indicating that persons other than Carmine Persco were the boss of the so-called Colombo family. Now, because that was the essence of the charge against Junior, if he had had those documents back in 1985, 1986, during the commission trial, he could have made some kind of an argument that based upon government official memos, that they have no right to put him in the case. And instead they hid that. And that's part of what our case was. And so it started for me in 1985, the commission case, and it resumed for me in the 2000s. And ultimately, I was able to find a great lawyer, Anthony DiPietro, who at the time was a young man, and I had a lot of faith and confidence in him because of things I knew that he had done. And I selected him to be the guy to do all the legal research and writing for Carmine Persco. And I introduced Anthony to Carmine, and Anthony and I and Carmine worked for about 4 years together, trying not so much to overturn the commission case, because they would never allow that to happen. There would be come hell or high water. They're never going to admit that they were wrong, even though I'm going to tell you how other defendants were proven to be innocent later on in this broadcast, I hope. But with regard to Carmine, we spent quite a few years putting together a motion for resentence, asking the court to resentenced Carmine from 100 years to time served, which at that point in time was 32 very long years. Carmine was actually in a prison hospital at that time in North Carolina. And so that's how the commission case revived itself for me. The commission case, which is the cornerstone, according to Rudi Giuliani, of everything the government's ever done with organized crime. This is it. This is the paramount, the ultimate. What is it? All a bunch of BS. There's another guy named Christy Tik Fennari. Okay, he was prosecuted in the commission case. The government alleged that he's the so-called number 3 man, the consigliere of what they call the Casey family. They accused this man of that. They convicted him of that. They sentenced him to 100 years on that. And what happens? 30 years later, one of their premier cooperators, a guy named Al Diarco put over 100 people in prison, okay? Over 100 people in prison at trial and by way of plea because of his cooperation. And Al Diarco was their golden boy. Al Diarco was their fair-haired boy. He was the man. And anything Al Diarco said had to be gold, according to the government. Well, what does Al Diarco tell them? He tells them 30 years later that Christopher Fennari, also known as Christy Tik, could never have been at any kind of so-called commission meeting. And according to Al Diarco, in his book, Mob Boss, which was written by Jerry Capisi and Tom Robbins, in that book he reveals that Christy Tik was not the number 3 man in the so-called family, that Christy Tik was not even eligible to be at a meeting, not even eligible to be at a meeting. So now, after Mr. Fennari has been in jail for almost 30 years at that time, you think that the government would release him immediately? No. They never want to admit that they're wrong. So eventually they released him because he was suffering from Alzheimer and dementia and every other disease that you could possibly imagine. And so they gave him a compassionate release instead of admitting that they were wrong, that they prosecuted a man in the commission case, Christopher Fennari, and they gave him 100 years, okay? And they let that stand. That conviction stands today, never overturned. They let him out because he was sick and that he was too sick for the prison officials to handle properly. Well, you think that's all? No, that's not all. I'm sure that many of you may have heard of a guy named Fat Tony Soleno. Fat Tony Soleno is portrayed in all of these mobster videos as, a grumpy old man with a hat squared down on his face and smoking a cigar and cursing at the reporters and all the rest of it. Fat Tony Soleno was accused by the government of the United States in the commission case, of being the boss of what they call Genovese family. Okay, and so Tony Soleno was convicted with all the rest of the guys who went on trial. Everyone was convicted in the commission case, okay? And what was his sentence? His sentence was 100 years. 100 years for a case. The facts of the case were that it was a bid rigging scheme. It was about construction sites, about getting construction jobs. I'll get into that at another time, because who could believe it? Who could believe that a bid rigging scheme could result in sentences of 100 years when ordinarily it would be 5-10 years? And if you want to add in that they put organized crime into it, say 15 years. 100 years at that point in time, and since then, is unprecedented in the legal system. Even in the upside-down, unfair world of the federal courts, it was unheard of and is still unheard of. 100 years. Fat Tony Soleno. He gets 100 years, and he dies in jail, just like Judge Owen said, yeah, I want all these guys to die in jail. They must die in jail. Oh, my God, really? They have to die in jail. Some of them so sick that it's unimaginable how they couldn't be released on compassionate release. Fat Tony Soleno dies in jail. Okay, what happened several years later? Well, in the I think 2012, the government brings a case against a gentleman named Vincent Gigante. He had a nickname. The government gave him a nickname, the Chin. Okay, Vincent the Chin Gigante was accused by the government of the United States of being the so-called boss of what they call Genovese family. Okay, and now in his trial, they accuse him of being the longtime boss. They even accuse him of being the so-called boss during the same period of time when they had previously said that Fat Tony Salerno was the boss of the family. So how many bosses can you have? A two-headed monster? A three-headed monster? Well, you know what the government said when the lawyers for Mr. Gigante attacked the proposition that he was the boss of the so-called family? The government said, well, you know what? We're right now. We were wrong then. And so they prosecuted Vincent Gigante. And part of the prosecution was that he was the boss way back during the period of time when the commission case was in progress. And they said, well, we made a mistake with Mr. Salerno. Mr. Salerno, he really wasn't the boss. He was a figurehead. It don't matter. Everything's brushed under the rug. If these weren't Italian Americans, the entire country would be outraged at all this. I mean, not that many years passed before 1, 2, 3 guys, clearly innocent. We're talking about Tony Soleno, Christopher Fennari, and Carmine Persico. All right, and nothing was done about it. Carmine Persco died in jail. Fat Tony Salerno died in jail, and Mr. Fennari was never exonerated. They never said, "Oh, you're innocent." How about you sue us and get like a couple of $1 million? No, they said, "Well, we're going to release you because you have Alzheimer's disease." So this is the way the government operates. Everything that they say is a groundbreaking landmark case is usually full of discrepancies, full of illegal activity on the part of the government, full of BS. They do whatever they want. They say whatever they want, and no one cares. And I'm going to tell you why no one cares. Because when it comes to Italian Americans in the federal criminal justice system, no one will stand up and stick their necks out and say the government is wrong and the government has to pay for this. In today's world, in this woke world, we see everything that the government has done being ripped apart, torn down. All of our societies, our constitution, everything's being torn apart. But still today, this very day, Italian Americans get treated so differently in the criminal justice system than any other group that you can imagine. And I'm talking, they could, if they got Chinese spies, they'd let them go instead of letting some Italian guy go. And that's part of what irks me about the commission case and about so many of the other cases. It's just a constant abuse of power by the government. So that's one of the reasons that I'm doing this podcast, not just to reveal stuff like that, but I didn't get a chance to be too lighthearted yet, but I've had a lot of experiences along the way fighting these battles. I can't say that it's been fun, but I can say that myself and many of the defendants that I've represented, we've had fun along the way because the people that I represent are not dogs. They're not scaredy cats. They understand what's going on here. And that's the most important part of it, to know that you're going to be treated differently than anyone else, that you're going to be investigated differently than anyone else, that when you're tried, that the evidence is going to be presented unfairly against you. When you're sentenced, you're going to be sentenced differently than anybody else. And when you go to prison, you're treated differently than any of the other inmates. And so that's part of the problem that we want to expose here on A View from Mulberry Street.